On a balmy morning in the spring of 1995, beneath the swaying palms and volcanic peaks of Hawaii's Big Island, a young woman named Dana Ireland pedaled her bicycle along the sun-dappled roads of Puna, a region known for its black sand beaches and tight-knit communities. She was 23 years old, visiting from Virginia, with sun-streaked hair and a quiet manner that endeared her to locals. The air that December day carried the scent of plumeria and salt, the trade winds rustling through the trees as Dana made her way along Kapoho Kai Drive, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through lava fields and dense tropical foliage. By nightfall, Dana would be found broken and barely breathing on a remote stretch of road, her bicycle twisted nearby, her clothing torn. She would pass away the following day at Hilo Medical Center, her lips unable to form the name of who had done this to her. For nearly 3 decades, her case would become one of Hawaii's most haunting mysteries, a wound that refused to heal in the heart of a community that prided itself on ohana and aloha. 3 men would eventually be convicted, their lives consumed by imprisonment and public hatred. But what if the real perpetrator had been walking free all along, hidden in plain sight, protected by silence and doubt? What if justice, when it finally arrived 29 years later, would shake the islands to their core and force an entire state to reckon with the possibility that they had destroyed innocent lives while letting a predator slip through their fingers? The district of Puna sprawls across the southeastern flank of Kilauea volcano, a land of contrasts where million-dollar ocean view estates stand within miles of off-grid homesteads powered by solar panels and rainwater catchment systems. In 1995, the area retained much of its rural character. Puna was a place where people knew their neighbors, where children played unsupervised in yards bordered by papaya trees and wild ginger, where doors remained unlocked and strangers were greeted with warm smiles. The roads twisted through tunnels of overhanging vegetation, some paved, others barely more than gravel tracks disappearing into the jungle. Lava rock walls marked property boundaries, their black stones stacked without mortar in the old Hawaiian way. The ocean was never far, its presence felt in the humid air and the distant sound of waves against ancient lava flows. Dana Ireland had arrived on the Big Island in late November, drawn by the promise of adventure and natural beauty that had beckoned travelers to these islands for generations. She was staying with friends in the Kapoho area, spending her days exploring tide pools, hiking volcanic trails, and riding her bicycle along the coastal roads. Those who met her during those brief weeks remembered her as gentle and curious, someone who seemed to find joy in the simple act of pedaling through paradise. She had a sketchbook that she carried in her backpack, filled with rough drawings of native birds and flowering plants. Her routine had become familiar to the handful of locals who lived along her usual routes. They would wave as she passed, this slender figure on a blue bicycle, her legs pumping steadily against the gradual inclines. December 24, 1995, dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that makes mainlanders question their decision to live anywhere with seasons. The temperature hovered in the low 80s, the humidity tempered by steady winds from the northeast. Dana set out from her friend's house around 4 in the afternoon, planning a leisurely ride before the Christmas Eve gathering scheduled for that evening. She wore a pink tank top and denim shorts, her feet in athletic sandals, a small pack secured to her bicycle frame. The roads were quiet that afternoon. Many residents had already retreated indoors to begin holiday preparations. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. At approximately 5:15, a passing motorist noticed a bicycle lying in the roadway along Kapoho Kai Drive, near the intersection with an unnamed dirt access road. The front wheel was bent at an unnatural angle, the frame scratched and dented. No rider was visible. The motorist slowed but did not stop, assuming someone had abandoned a broken bicycle. They would later struggle to live with that decision, replaying the moment endlessly in the years to come. 45 minutes later, at 6 o'clock, another driver spotted what appeared to be a person lying in the underbrush approximately 20 feet from the roadway. They pulled over and approached cautiously. Dana Ireland lay on her back in the tall grass, her body positioned between the road and a stand of ironwood trees. Her injuries were catastrophic. Her face was swollen and discolored from blunt force trauma. Her clothing had been partially removed. She was alive but unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. The person who found her ran back to their vehicle and drove to the nearest house with a telephone, pounding on the door and shouting for help. Within minutes, emergency services received the call. An ambulance was dispatched from Pahoa, the nearest town, approximately 15 minutes away under normal conditions. The first responders arrived as twilight deepened into darkness. Portable lights were set up, casting harsh illumination across the scene. Paramedics worked quickly, establishing an airway, checking vital signs, preparing Dana for transport. The injuries they documented were extensive: severe head trauma, fractured facial bones, internal injuries consistent with assault. There were tire marks on her body. She had been run over, possibly multiple times. The paramedics exchanged glances but said nothing, their faces grim as they lifted the stretcher into the ambulance. The vehicle pulled away, its sirens cutting through the evening air, racing north toward Hilo. Police officers secured the scene, stretching yellow tape between tree trunks and roadside markers. They photographed the bicycle, its twisted frame and shredded tires. They photographed the area where Dana had been found, marking the trampled grass and broken branches. They searched for evidence in the fading light, using flashlights to scan the ground for anything that might identify who had done this. They found little: no discarded weapons, no wallet or identification, no clear tire impressions in the hard-packed earth near the roadway. The road itself yielded nothing useful. Kapoho Kai Drive saw regular traffic, and dozens of vehicles had passed over any potential tire marks in the hours before Dana was discovered. By midnight, word had spread through Puna that something terrible had happened. Police went door to door along Kapoho Kai Drive and the surrounding streets, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual that afternoon. Most residents reported nothing out of the ordinary. A few mentioned seeing a blue bicycle earlier in the day, confirming it had been Dana. One elderly man recalled hearing what might have been shouting around 5 o'clock, but he couldn't be certain of the direction or duration. The sounds had blended with the wind and the distant crash of waves. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Dana Ireland passed away on Christmas Day, December 25, 1995, at 2:14 in the afternoon. She never regained consciousness. The doctors and nurses who had worked through the night to save her stood silent as the monitors flatlined, the steady beep giving way to a single sustained tone. Her parents, who had been frantically arranging flights from Virginia, were somewhere over the Pacific Ocean when their daughter took her last breath. They would land to the worst news imaginable, their Christmas destroyed, their lives forever divided into before and after. The investigation expanded immediately. What had been an assault case became a homicide investigation, drawing resources from across the Big Island. Hawaii County Police Department established a dedicated task force, pulling detectives from other cases to focus solely on finding Dana Ireland's killer. The FBI offered assistance, sending agents experienced in violent crimes and forensic analysis. The community rallied with an intensity that surprised even longtime residents. Volunteers organized search parties, combing the roadsides and lava fields for evidence that police might have missed. Flyers were printed and distributed, asking anyone with information to come forward. Local businesses offered rewards totaling $50,000 for information leading to an arrest. The medical examiner's report, completed 3 days after Dana's passing, confirmed what investigators already suspected. She had been struck by a vehicle, dragged beneath it for some distance, then moved to the location where she was found. The head trauma was consistent with being struck by or thrown against a hard surface. The internal injuries suggested prolonged assault. Biological evidence was collected, preserved, and sent to mainland laboratories for analysis. DNA testing in 1995 was far less sophisticated than it would later become, but the samples were carefully stored, cataloged, and secured. Detectives constructed a timeline of Dana's final hours. She had left her friend's house at 4:05 in the afternoon. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing her riding south on Kapoho Kai Drive between 4:15 and 4:45. The last confirmed sighting placed her near the intersection with the access road, where her bicycle was later found, at approximately 4:50. That left a window of roughly 25 minutes during which something had happened, though investigators suspected the actual attack occurred in a much shorter time frame. The question became, where was Dana between 4:50 and 5:15 when her bicycle was first noticed in the roadway? Those who knew the area whispered their theories in grocery store aisles and at gas stations. Some suggested Dana had been forced off the road by an aggressive driver, perhaps someone impaired or simply careless, who had then panicked and fled. Others believed the attack was deliberate, that someone had targeted her specifically, watching and waiting for the right moment. A few darkly suggested that multiple people might have been involved, that the injuries Dana sustained required more than one perpetrator. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about similar cases on the mainland, about serial predators who targeted young women in isolated areas. The first suspect emerged within days. A local man named Frank Pauline Jr. came to police attention through his own behavior. Pauline, 31 years old, had a criminal history that included assault and substance-related offenses. On December 27, just 2 days after Dana's passing, Pauline approached a police officer in Pahoa and asked specific questions about the investigation. His interest seemed excessive, his manner agitated. When detectives interviewed him, his account of his whereabouts on December 24 kept shifting. First, he claimed to have been home all day. Then he said he had been driving around Puna. Finally, he mentioned being near Kapoho Kai Drive that afternoon, but couldn't remember exactly when or why. Detectives pressed him. Pauline became defensive, then hostile. He refused to answer additional questions without an attorney. This response, while legally prudent, struck investigators as suspicious. They began surveillance on Pauline, watching his movements, documenting his contacts. They learned he had 2 younger brothers, Sean Schweitzer and Ian Schweitzer, with whom he spent considerable time. The 3 men were known to drive around together, often in a Volkswagen Beetle that Pauline's girlfriend owned. Witnesses had seen the vehicle in the Kapoho area on December 24, though exact times and locations varied depending on who was asked. The investigation focused intensely on these 3 men. Police interviewed everyone who knew them, building profiles of their habits, their associates, their typical routes of travel. They executed search warrants on the homes where the men stayed, seizing clothing, collecting hair and fiber samples, examining the Volkswagen for evidence. They found nothing definitive. The car had been cleaned thoroughly, its interior showing signs of recent scrubbing. Pauline's explanation was simple. His girlfriend had cleaned it before they visited relatives for Christmas. The timing, he insisted, was coincidental. In January 1996, police announced a breakthrough. DNA evidence had identified male genetic material from the crime scene. The samples were partial and degraded, but analysts believed they could eventually be matched to a suspect. The announcement sent ripples through Pune. Whoever had done this left biological evidence behind. It was only a matter of time, police assured the public, before advanced testing would reveal the killer's identity. Months passed. The DNA proved more difficult to analyze than initially hoped. The samples were contaminated with Dana's biological material and environmental elements from the roadside location. Testing technology in 1996 couldn't provide the clear results investigators needed. The case remained open but lost momentum. Detectives continued following leads, interviewing potential witnesses, but the trail grew colder with each passing week. Pauline Schweitzer and the other Schweitzer brother remained persons of interest, but were never charged. They went about their lives, aware they were being watched, their movements documented by police who lacked sufficient evidence for arrest. Dana's parents, John and Louise Ireland, established a reward fund and memorial scholarship in their daughter's name. They flew to Hawaii 3 times that first year, meeting with investigators, holding press conferences, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. John Ireland, a quiet man who worked in pharmaceutical sales, struggled to contain his anger during these public appearances. His voice would crack when he spoke about Dana, about her kindness, about the life she would never live. Louise Ireland appeared hollowed out by grief, her eyes distant even when she was looking directly at someone. They couldn't understand how someone could do this and simply disappear into the tropical landscape, protected by silence or ignorance. By 1997, the investigation had effectively stalled. The task force was dissolved, its members reassigned to other cases. Dana Ireland's file remained open, but the active pursuit of leads had ceased. The community tried to move forward while carrying the weight of unresolved trauma. Parents drove their children everywhere, no longer trusting the casual safety that had once defined island life. Women stopped jogging or cycling alone. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. The attack had shattered something fundamental about how Pune residents understood their world. Then, in late 1999, nearly 4 years after Dana's passing, police received new information. A woman came forward, claiming that Frank Pauline Jr. had confessed to her, describing details about Dana Ireland's case that had never been made public. She said Pauline had been drinking heavily one night and started talking about something terrible he had done, something he couldn't take back. He had mentioned a girl on a bicycle, mentioned Kapoho, mentioned brothers helping him. The woman, who had since ended her relationship with Pauline, said the confession had haunted her for years. She finally felt strong enough to tell police what she knew. Detectives reopened the active investigation. They brought Pauline in for questioning. This time, they had leverage. They told him they had a witness who would testify about his confession. They suggested his brothers might be willing to cooperate to save themselves. They offered the possibility of reduced charges if he admitted his involvement. Pauline, after hours of interrogation, made statements that investigators interpreted as confessions. The exact wording would later be disputed, with defense attorneys claiming the statements were coerced and ambiguous, but prosecutors believed they had enough to move forward. In May 2000, more than 4 years after Dana Ireland was found dying in the grass along Kapoho Kai Drive, Frank Pauline Jr. and his half-brothers, Sean Schweitzer and Ian Schweitzer, were arrested and charged in connection with her assault and death. The arrests made front-page news across Hawaii. Television crews descended on Pune, filming B-roll of the roads where Dana had ridden, interviewing neighbors who remembered that Christmas Eve. the Ireland family released a statement expressing cautious hope that justice might finally be served. The legal proceedings would stretch across years, becoming some of the most complex and contested in Hawaii's judicial history. Frank Pauline Jr. was tried first. Prosecutors presented circumstantial evidence. His presence in the area, his suspicious behavior, the confession reported by his former associate, and statements he had made to police. The defense argued that the evidence was insufficient, that no physical evidence definitively linked Pauline to the crime, that his statements to police had been misinterpreted or coerced. The jury deliberated for days before returning a guilty verdict. Pauline was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. His half-brothers Sean and Ian Schweitzer faced separate trials. Ian Schweitzer accepted a plea agreement, testifying that he had been present when Pauline attacked Dana, but claimed he had not participated directly. His testimony implicated both Pauline and Sean. He described how they had been driving around Puna that afternoon, drinking and looking for trouble. He said Pauline spotted Dana on her bicycle and made a comment about wanting to hurt her. He described how Pauline forced Dana off the road with their vehicle, how she was placed in the car, how she was driven to an isolated location. His account was detailed, but would later be questioned for inconsistencies with physical evidence. Sean Schweitzer maintained his innocence throughout his trial. He testified that he had been nowhere near Kapoho Kai Drive on December 24, 1995. He said his brother Ian was lying to secure a reduced sentence. The prosecution countered with Ian's testimony and with evidence placing Sean in the general area that afternoon. The jury convicted him. He was sentenced to life in prison. For the Ireland family, the convictions brought a measure of closure. John Ireland told reporters that while nothing could bring Dana back, knowing her killers would spend the rest of their lives behind bars allowed him to finally sleep through the night. Louise Ireland was less convinced. She attended every hearing, studying the faces of the accused men, searching for remorse or recognition. She saw only denial and anger. In private moments, she confessed to friends that something about the case still felt incomplete, though she couldn't articulate exactly what troubled her. The years rolled forward like waves against lava rock, relentless and smoothing. Frank Pauline Jr. died in prison in 2015, maintaining his innocence to the end. Sean Schweitzer filed numerous appeals, all denied. Ian Schweitzer served his reduced sentence and was eventually released, disappearing into quiet obscurity. Dana Ireland became a name spoken in hushed tones, a cautionary tale, a symbol of paradise interrupted by violence. Her case was taught in criminal justice courses as an example of community cooperation and persistent investigation, leading to convictions despite challenging circumstances. But DNA technology, which had failed to provide clear answers in 1995, continued advancing. By the early 2020s, techniques existed that could extract usable profiles from samples that would have been deemed worthless decades earlier. Cold case units across the country began re-examining old evidence, running new tests, comparing results against continuously expanding databases. In Hawaii, the state's Innocence Project had been raising questions about the Ireland convictions for years, pointing to weaknesses in the evidence and troubling aspects of how the investigation had been conducted. Advocates noted that no physical evidence had ever definitively linked any of the convicted men to Dana. The testimony that formed the backbone of the prosecutions came from accomplice witnesses with questionable credibility and potential motivations to fabricate. In 2023, attorneys representing Sean Schweitzer filed a motion requesting that biological evidence from Dana Ireland's case be subjected to modern DNA analysis. Prosecutors initially opposed the motion, arguing that the case had been resolved and the verdicts should stand. But public pressure mounted. Newspaper editorials questioned whether the state had anything to fear from DNA testing if the right men had truly been convicted. The Ireland family, now just John Ireland after Louise had passed away in 2018, added their voice to the call for testing. John Ireland said in an interview that he wanted absolute certainty, that if there was any possibility mistakes had been made, he needed to know, even if it meant reopening wounds he thought had healed. The court ordered the testing. Samples that had been preserved for nearly 3 decades were sent to a laboratory specializing in forensic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis. Technicians worked carefully, extracting every possible fragment of genetic material, building profiles using techniques that hadn't existed when Dana was attacked. In October 2023, the results came back. The DNA profile developed from evidence collected from Dana's body and clothing did not match Frank Pauline Jr., Sean Schweitzer, or Ian Schweitzer. It matched no one in the convicted trio. The implications were staggering. The DNA did, however, match someone. Using genealogical databases and family tree construction, investigators identified a potential suspect, Albert Ian Schweitzer, no relation to Sean or Ian Schweitzer despite the shared surname. Albert Schweitzer was 66 years old in 2023, a resident of the Big Island who had lived in the Puna area for decades. He had been interviewed briefly during the original 1995 investigation, but had never been considered a serious suspect. His name appeared on a list of local men who owned vehicles similar to those witnesses had reported seeing near the crime scene. But detectives had focused their attention so intensely on Pauline and the Schweitzer brothers that other leads had been deprioritized or abandoned. Investigators began surveillance on Albert Schweitzer. They observed his daily routines, documenting his movements, waiting for an opportunity to obtain a direct DNA sample for comparison. In January 2024, that opportunity arrived. Albert Schweitzer discarded a water bottle at a public beach. Officers retrieved it from a trash receptacle. The sample was analyzed and compared to the profile developed from Dana Ireland's case. The match was conclusive. The DNA found on Dana belonged to Albert Schweitzer. On January 31, 2024, 29 years and 1 month after Dana Ireland's attack, police arrested Albert Ian Schweitzer at his home in Hawaiian Paradise Park. Officers surrounded the property at dawn, executing a search warrant and taking Schweitzer into custody without incident. He appeared stunned, according to officers present, repeatedly asking what this was about. When informed he was being arrested in connection with the Dana Ireland case, he reportedly said nothing else, invoking his right to remain silent. The arrest made international headlines. Media outlets across the world covered the story of a cold case solved by DNA technology, of innocent men potentially imprisoned for decades, of a killer who had hidden in plain sight for nearly 30 years. Hawaii's Attorney General announced that the state would immediately review the convictions of Sean Schweitzer and posthumously examine the case against Frank Pauline Jr. Ian Schweitzer, the brother who had testified against the others, could not be located for immediate comment. Sean Schweitzer, who had spent 23 years in prison for a crime he insisted he didn't commit, was released pending further proceedings. Photographs showed him walking out of Halawa Correctional Facility in Oahu, his hair gray, his face lined with decades of incarceration. He made no statement to the assembled press, simply climbed into a waiting vehicle and disappeared down the road. His attorneys announced plans to file a wrongful conviction lawsuit against the state of Hawaii and the investigators whose tunnel vision had led to his imprisonment. The community of Puna, which had believed for 29 years that justice had been served, struggled to process the revelation. Albert Schweitzer had been their neighbor all this time. Some residents recognized his name but couldn't place his face. Others realized with horror that they knew him, had seen him at community events, had waved to him on the street. He had been hiding behind the fact that justice had seemingly been achieved, that the case had been closed, that everyone had moved on. He had attended local gatherings where people sometimes mentioned Dana Ireland, had probably heard countless conversations about the case, had known that 3 men were serving life sentences for what he had done. Those who had defended Pauline and the Schweitzer brothers felt vindicated and furious. Family members who had spent decades insisting their loved ones were innocent had been dismissed as delusional or in denial. Now they were owed apologies that would never fully compensate for the years stolen, the reputations destroyed, the lives ended in prison. Frank Pauline Jr.'s family held a press conference demanding a posthumous exoneration and financial compensation for their suffering. They displayed photographs of Frank as a young man, as a father, as someone who had deserved better than to die behind bars for something he hadn't done. Prosecutors working on the case against Albert Schweitzer moved methodically. They reviewed every piece of evidence collected in 1995, examining it through the lens of this new suspect. They discovered that Albert Schweitzer had been driving a vehicle in December 1995 that matched witness descriptions better than the Volkswagen Beetle associated with Pauline. They found that he had taken his car to a body shop in early January 1996, requesting repairs to front-end damage he claimed had come from hitting a wild pig on a dark road. The mechanic who had performed the work remembered the job because the damage had seemed inconsistent with an animal strike. He had mentioned this detail to police during the original investigation, but it had been noted and filed away. Never followed up on because investigators were already convinced they knew who was responsible. Albert Schweitzer's attorney entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. The attorney suggested that DNA evidence alone couldn't tell the complete story, that there might be innocent explanations for his client's genetic material being present. Prosecutors responded by noting the specific nature of the biological evidence and the circumstances under which it was collected. They filed notice that they intended to seek the maximum possible sentence if Schweitzer was convicted. The preliminary hearings were held in Hilo, in the same courthouse where Pauline and the Schweitzer brothers had been tried decades earlier. Albert Schweitzer, wearing an orange jumpsuit and restraints, sat silently at the defense table. He was a small man, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd. His eyes, witnesses noted, never focused on anyone directly. He stared at the table or at some point on the far wall, his expression blank. Dana's father, John Ireland, now 79 years old, attended the hearing. He had flown from Virginia one more time, making this journey he had hoped never to repeat. When asked by reporters how he felt about the new arrest, he spoke slowly, choosing each word carefully. He said he was grateful for the DNA technology that had finally revealed the truth. He said he was horrified that innocent men had been convicted, that he had unknowingly supported their imprisonment, that he had believed justice had been served when it hadn't. He said he hoped Albert Schweitzer would face accountability, but that nothing could truly make this right. Too many lives had been destroyed. Too much time had been lost. His voice broke when he mentioned Louise, how she had died still believing the wrong men had been caught, how she would never know that Dana's real attacker had finally been identified. The case moved toward trial with the slow inevitability of legal proceedings. Evidence was examined by expert witnesses. Depositions were taken. Motions were filed and argued. The state of Hawaii formally vacated Sean Schweitzer's conviction in June 2024, issuing an official acknowledgement that he had been wrongfully imprisoned. Discussions began about compensation, though no amount of money could return the decades he had lost. Efforts to posthumously exonerate Frank Pauline Jr. met with bureaucratic resistance, the machinery of justice reluctant to admit such a profound error even in death. Through it all, the Big Island's landscape remained unchanged. The roads of Puna still twisted through lava fields and tropical forest. The ocean still crashed against black sand beaches. Bicyclists still pedaled along coastal routes, though perhaps more cautiously now, more aware of how quickly paradise could turn predatory. Dana Ireland's name was spoken again, not just as a victim, but as a person who had been denied justice for 29 years, while the wrong men paid the price for another man's actions. Albert Ian Schweitzer's trial is scheduled for later this year. The evidence against him appears overwhelming. DNA analysis places him at the scene. Vehicle records and witness statements that had been overlooked in the original investigation now point directly to him. But trials are unpredictable, and outcomes are never guaranteed. What is certain is that the case of Dana Ireland has exposed deep flaws in how justice was pursued, in how investigators became convinced of a theory and then sought only evidence that supported it, discarding or minimizing anything that suggested alternative explanations. For those who have ever believed in the infallibility of the criminal justice system, this case stands as a stark reminder that good intentions and hard work are not always enough. Confirmation bias, pressure to solve high-profile cases, and limitations of available technology can combine to produce catastrophic results. 3 men were convicted and imprisoned. 1 died maintaining his innocence. The real perpetrator remained free for 29 years. The victim's family spent decades believing justice had been served when it hadn't. The community's trust in law enforcement and the courts was shaken to its foundation. The swing hung still on the day Dana Ireland was attacked. The toys of Puna's children scattered in yards where parents now kept constant watch. The bicycle she rode lay twisted in an evidence locker for 29 years, a silent witness to the failure of justice. The toy truck of childhood innocence lay on its side in the collective memory of a community that learned too late that believing something doesn't make it true. Clear's throat, Dana Ireland was 23 years old when she pedaled into the last hours of her life on December 24, 1995. She deserved justice delivered swiftly and correctly. Instead, she became a symbol of how wrong things can go when certainty replaces careful investigation, when pressure to solve a case overshadows the obligation to get it right. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.